Hey everyone, Rho here. Before we begin today, seeing as it's nearly Christmas, I thought it's about time you had another week special treat on the channel. So next week we will have a Heroes of the Imperium week, dedicated to some of the most notable chapter masters and captains. But once we're done with that, we will pit them together for your vote. A contest of champions to see who is the greatest hero of the Imperium. Like our traitor Legion war earlier in the year, only one will be left standing triumphant. And in particular, just a little side note for those of you maybe not having the best of times right now over the Christmas period, I hope this will give you a little something to look forward to and enjoy every day over Christmas. This one is going to be for you guys. But with all that said, on to today. Now, with the announcement of Space Marine 2, I thought it would only be right to discuss a little Captain Titus, as we ask if there is any way he could fit into the current lore narrative. Now, we're going to be talking some general current lore and the events obviously of the original Space Marine, so general spoiler warning to begin. But with that said, let's just jump straight in. Okay, now for those of you who may not be aware, Captain Titus was the star character of the video game Space Marine, released back in the year of 2011. And as you may have guessed, Titus was a captain of the Ultramarines chapter, and a captain of the Second Company. Now, the premise of the game was an orc invasion overrunning a forge world, in which Titus and his faithful companions must overcome all the odds to defend, or at least do their best until a reinforcement fleet can arrive. And without going into too many in-depth spoilers of all the events, as you may guess, Titus is on the whole successful. However, at the end of the campaign, spoiler, he leaves under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, who were to ensure he had received no chaos corruption. Now, the original game was not canon to the main 40k timeline. However, seeing as the game and character's popularity has risen over the years, being considered a pretty much cult classic, and with the sequel now being revealed, could we see this character introduced or moved into the main narrative? Well, anything is of course possible, so how could it work? What difficulties are there to stop it? Well, first off, the biggest and most obvious would be Titus being the captain of the Ultramarines Second Company. Currently, the captain of the Second Company within the lore is a certain Captain Akaran, who assumed the role during Cato Sicarius' disappearance within the warp, and he has remained in this role even after Sicarius' return. Sicarius instead was appointed head of Guilliman's Victrix Guard. So we have two possibilities here, either a bit of a retcon and moving Titus to be Sicarius' replacement instead of Akaran, or have Titus have been Second Company captain during an earlier time period, which then leads us on to the problem of him becoming Primaris, because old Titus has quite clearly crossed the Rubicon in the latest trailer. And as we know, Primaris were only unveiled after the destruction of Cadia and Rabute Guilliman's return, a time we know Sicarius and Akaran had Second Company leadership on lockdown. However, all hope is not lost here, because not only is Titus a Primaris in the new trailer, he also appears to be the rank of Lieutenant, or Lieutenant for my fellow countrymen, and I'm judging that by the markings of his helm. I don't know why I say Lieutenant, guys. Too much American TV as a kid, I guess. I'm sure you've all seen the trailer by now, but if not, I'll drop a link into the description anyway. It's definitely worth another watch just for the sheer awesomeness of it. By far and away my favourite 40k trailer since the fabled Dawn of War 2 one, which is still one of my favourite 40k cinematics to this date. However, continuing on, having Titus being a lieutenant does make his theoretical immersion into the main narrative a much more smoother possibility. I mean, hey, lieutenants a dime a dozen compared to captains. The law isn't quite as prominent on them. Changing a lieutenant here or there isn't going to be as much of a big deal, and most of us, to be honest, wouldn't even notice. So, Titus was formerly a captain of the Second Company, and since has been demoted to lieutenant. We know he must have been captain prior to Sicarius becoming Second Company captain himself. And although Agamben was said to have been Second Company captain previously to his elevation to First Company captain, I think you could slide Titus into this gap if you really wanted to. Or worst case, keep it as Titus was Second Company captain prior to Agamben. Now, it was said he had served the chapter for 150 years by the time of the events of the first game. And this isn't an astronomical amount of time for a Space Marine by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't stated that he'd been captain for 150 years, only that he had served the chapter. So I think we do have a lot of room to play here. Titus's time as captain could have been a fairly short one, or perhaps considering his demotion, his reign as captain could have even been stricken from the record. So how can a captain be demoted, I hear you cry? Well, judging by his very appearance within the latest trailer, quite clearly adorning the blue of Ultramarines once more, it's safe to say he passed whatever tests the Inquisition had in store for him at the end of the original game. There's obviously no chance, if there was even a hint of heresy or corruption, that he would have been returned to the chapter alive. So we know Titus passed whatever tests the Inquisition had in store. However, that wasn't the only charge laid against Titus, who was also accused of many frequent breakings of the Codex Astartes. And for this, we actually have a very similar tale within the lore to relate to, and this involves a certain fellow Ultramarines captain, one by the name of Uriel Ventris. During the events of the novel Warriors of Ultramar, Ventris leads the defense of a world named Tarsis Ultra against the Tyranid menace. And despite ultimately being victorious, it is such a desperate conflict that he was forced to use unorthodox actions, to say the least. And upon returning to Macragge, Ventris was trialed and found guilty for being in breach of the Codex Astartes, and his punishment was exile from the chapter on a death oath. Now, while Ventris completed his oath and returned to the chapter, finally redeeming his rank as 4th Company captain, the same doesn't necessarily have to be true for Titus. Firstly, his actions in particular didn't see him abandoning his position within the chapter, which surprisingly Uriel Ventris's did. And so, considering that, I'm not sure it would require as extreme a sanction for Titus as exile from the chapter. A demotion to lieutenant, however, while unusual as far as we know, is much more understandable. Especially so considering it relates to Titus's leadership within the field. So, having passed the Inquisition's tests and ultimately returned to the chapter, Titus, who would have been replaced anyway during his absence by, say, Agamben, would have found himself facing another trial for breaking the Codex, and ultimately the punishment being not regaining his former rank, which maybe you could even then have going to Sicarius on a permanent position, as Agamemnon moved on to first company captain. It all works rather nicely. Now, if you wanted to play around with it somewhat, depending on the timescale of how long he'd been with the Inquisition, you could have Titus returning to be a sergeant before crossing the Rubicon, or if he returned after the Primaris introduction, you could even have him sliding straight in as a lieutenant. So while it remains to be seen, and maybe is a bit unlikely, as far as I'm concerned it's definitely possible to me that Titus could well be introduced as a character to the mainline lore, which would definitely be fun to see him on the tabletop. But as always guys, what do you think? Would you like to see Titus introduced to the main lore narrative? And if so, does this argument work for you? If not, how would you like to see Titus introduced? Could you see him being given a model for the tabletop one day? As always guys, leave your thoughts in the comments below, I love to read them. Huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. And if you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.